To help us build a roadmap toward the future of work, we have two great guests to kick it off. One to share insights from the evolution of work, and the other to offer a real-time snapshot of where we are today. Joining us now, two Jameses. James Suzman, he's an anthropologist and author of the upcoming work, From the Stone Age to the Age of Robots, and James Manyika. He's a McKinsey senior partner and chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute, and they will be interviewed by my friend, John Fort. John, it's yours.
Tyler, thank you. Thank you, and thank you, James Manyika and James Suzman, for being with us. And James Manyika, I want to start with the study that and survey that McKinsey did in June. 800 businesses, I believe, half in the U.S., half outside, really looking at how they've adjusted in this pandemic reality and what they expect to do going forward. I really thought it was interesting. There was a lot of talk in the beginning about how work has permanently changed and work at home was going to be a real new reality. It seems like the hybrid is a bit more likely, right? And that possibly more work will be in the office long term?
Yes, thank you, John. It was quite astounding to learn from the survey that we did, because it also confirmed some of the research that we've been seeing. So a few things from that survey. First, it was very, very clear that everybody's accelerated how much digital they're doing. I think something like 85% of the companies and the executives in that survey indicated that they'd accelerated, for example, the use of digital collaboration tools, how their workers interacted and did their work. There was another sort of 50% or so who had also accelerated the use of digital channels, and obviously that it also had impact on how their people did work. Others did the same thing also in their supply chain and so forth. And also, surprisingly, for its size, about 2/3 said that I also accelerated their adoption and use of AI technologies and other forms of automation. This was quite interesting, John. But to your question about, bring it down to what does that mean for work? Many were actually saying that they imagined that they might actually give their workers ongoing post-COVID flexibility to work from home if they wanted. Many said they were starting to experiment with these hybrid models where some people could spend a couple of days at work in the office, the other days that had the flexibility. But the emergence of this possible hybrid picture was quite interesting. Let me say one other quick thing that I think we should all keep in mind. Keep in mind that if you look across all the work that gets done, say, in the United States, only about 1/3 of those jobs in that work can be done remotely. There's another 2/3 of people who are in the US workforce who actually have to show up somewhere physically in order to do their work. These are people who work in restaurants, in various other places in hospitality, where they actually have to show up somewhere. So while I think work from home is important, we should keep in mind that it's not possible for everybody.
Right. If you're working in an Amazon warehouse, if you're clearly working in a restaurant. One follow-up I want to ask you, James Manyika, on that study and its implications. So just dealing with that third that can work remotely, largely knowledge workers, how do we account, do you think, for the disparity between, you've got Netflix saying there's nothing good about working remote, we can't wait to get our folks back in the office. You've got some smaller companies that are giving up offices entirely, at least for the time being. And then you got companies in the middle, like, say, Adobe, that are saying, hey, work at home is great for some things, but when we're trying to get a team together for new interfaces, brand new topics, remote doesn't work as well. We actually want to get them together in a room. How do we account for that wide difference, even among knowledge workers?
Well, I think the differences are to be expected, because I think some companies, by virtue of their culture and the nature of certain work that they do like the frictional kind of interactions that happen when people are actually in a room thinking together. The fact that the ideas can spark in a way that can't be scheduled on a Zoom or whatever platform you happen to be using. I think that's what you're hearing from the companies who are saying, we would like to bring some of our people back, at least for some of the time. That's why this hybrid question is going to be quite interesting. I think we're going to see a flowering of experiments over the coming year or so, actually, on this question. And it's going to be quite interesting to see how it actually plays out. But I think the point about which occupations do lose out, what kind of jobs do lose out in the frictional teaming that happens when people are together versus others where that's not the case, that's going to be where a lot of the innovation is going to be. It's going to be quite interesting, John.
And James Suzman, thank you. James Suzman, this is where I want to turn to you for some historical context and some sense of how these things do tend to shift. What in the past has made dramatic changes to the way that we work? Has it been the tools available? Has it been other economic forces? Has it been social forces? And where is this pandemic, you think, going to fit within that context of history?
It depends how long you take a historical view for. I mean, we've been through in the history of work some astonishingly huge revolutions, and they've changed everything. These are revolutions from, for example, the invention of fire several 100,000 years ago to the agricultural revolution, which completely transformed the work landscape. And of course, where we are now, the digital revolution. Now, what we've had with COVID, I think, is really an acceleration of forces that were already massively in play. And these forces have been brought in by environmental consequences, but mostly and most recently by automation and the advent of digital communication. And the very fact that we've been able during this COVID crisis to be able to continue to work, those of us at least in the information industry, to be able to continue to work is a testament to these forces that were already changing things in as fundamental a way as the motor car and the invention of large roads, which enable people to commute in and out of cities, changed the way people work. And I think we're on the cusp of something far larger than the kind of small telltale things that we're looking at and that businesses are dealing with. Obviously, people are, in the fog of war at the moment, and they're fighting the battle that's right in front of them. But I think if we sort of use the metaphor that was on earlier when the doctor was speaking about being in a playing a round of golf, we're going to finish this round of golf and we're going to leave the clubhouse to discover that the world around us has transformed completely.
Okay, so give us then a sense of how a leader and how a business should decide which categories of change they best fit in. Should they get everybody back to the office as quickly as possible? And I'm thinking about knowledge workers here, maybe with a hybrid model, but tilting heavily toward in-person interactions. Or should they push on the idea of restructuring the way that work happens so that, yes, you've got a significant percentage of people who are working remote all the time and some people in the office? How do you figure out which type of business and culture you are for most efficiency?
Well, I think there's no simple answer to this question. The key really is to be adaptable, to be flexible, and to be willing to experiment. The truth is nobody has any of the answers to these questions. We can identify some of the long-term trends, so we can understand the impact of digitization. We've learned a great deal about how people respond to the flexibility of not being tied to, for example, a very long commute into work. The ability to actually be in closer proximity to their children some of the time. We've also understood that people miss out on that kind of, as James described it, that sort of friction that comes of being in the office, that dynamism, that face-to-face interplay. And I think what people have to do is when they engage in a new normal, we've got to abandon dogma. People have to be willing to experiment, to try new things, and to realize that actually the environment is shifting. When you're on an iceberg that's swaying one way or another and you can't read the cracks, it's pointless tying your tent to one particular space. You've got to be flexible and you've got to be agile. And I think that has to be the absolute priority, is to recognize that we are in uncharted territory. And of course, as I said earlier, this uncharted territory has far deeper currents than the mere tides of COVID. We have automation, which, of course, in the McKinsey report that James was talking about, is a massive thing. And there's been a huge increase in automation and AI use within the COVID period. That's a major changing thing. And then, of course, the other big one are the environmental limits on growth and energy use. And that is something that businesses have already been adapting to and that we will continue to adapt to. But flexibility, adaptability, and not being tied to dogma is the absolute key.
And John, if I may,
James Manyika, coming back to you, flexibility. I want to ask you specifically about flexibility and adaptability, because those seem to me like things that are most easily practiced by people who already have competence in the corporate culture. Newer people who perhaps aren't known, who need to become known, who are looking to get promoted. It's very unclear to me how they become known and part of a culture in a work environment that's not so established, that's fluid, where people are remote. Is that an issue that you got any insight into from this survey or from McKinsey's other work, how it comes to bear during this pandemic and post-pandemic time?
I think, John, you've put your finger on a very, very important point. One of the things we're finding, and it came up in the survey, but also just in seeing how companies operate, is that new recruits or new hires or new joiners are having the toughest time, partly because, if you look at the teams and people who are functioning reasonably well and quite productively in this kind of remote world, they've tended to be people who've worked with each other for a very long time. They've got a built-up store of experiences, trust, things that they've done before in the past, and that they're mining that store, if you like, or that capital, and using it to be productive remotely. It's very tough for a joiner who doesn't have the benefit of that. So onboarding is becoming an interesting challenge, and it's been done, partly effectively. So this is one of the key things that's proving to be difficult. And you're seeing, again, some interesting experiments as people try to find ways to tackle that joiner onboarding set of challenges. I wanted to go back again, perhaps to something that I think the other James, my namesake, pointed out about the role of automation and adaptability. One of the things that remains true for companies and employers, though, is in fact coping with the future of work in terms of the impact that technology is going to have. And COVID just accelerated that. We've known for some time that things like reskilling, adaptability, learning, lifelong learning, and dealing with the kinds of the relatively assured trends around the future of work is quite fundamental. And I think that has to continue even as we navigate through COVID.
James Suzman, this issue of new recruits, the difficulty that they might be having, makes me want to call again on your background as an anthropologist and this idea of initiation. We tend not to perhaps think of us actually doing formal initiations in corporate culture, but we sort of do. So is it a matter of thinking more specifically about how that works within a culture and how it can work when physical presence isn't so much a constant? Do we need to think about moving people through stages of being known and knowing the values of an organization, even in those terms?
Well, you're absolutely right. Look, through history, actually, ever since humans have lived in cities, their work has, in a sense, been their village, their primary social identity. When we live in a city, first thing we ask when we meet somebody is, what job do you do? Who do you work for? And by that, we know a great deal about them, and we get to understand who they are, where they are, what their social context is. So work has always been a great deal more than simply how we spend our time or how we earn our money. And that is one of the big shifts that people are going to have to cope with, certainly in the short term. And in the longer term, if we continue having a less centralized office structure, will be ways to forge that kind of common identity. But there is comfort to be had in this, in that, again, when I talk about flexibility and adaptability, we're learning on our feet. If we think through the history of work in our cities, even in recent terms, if I go outside down the road to London, for example, a century ago, there weren't any big offices. There were neighborhoods which were designed. there are all sorts of names, Vinters Row and so on, which were based around specific trades and specific social identities and specific ways of organizing themselves, and specific communities of work. And those changed and were overtaken by offices during the office boom in the last century. And something else will certainly replace that. Now, it's certainly for businesses who are trying to establish a corporate culture. There is no substitute, I think, for the tactile sense of the real that comes from face-to-face engagement. And while I think the future of work will involve a great deal more flexibility in terms of home and office space, I think it's like, once you give somebody a tax cut, it's very hard to take it away from them. And if people have enjoyed having more contact with their children when they can, they'll certainly want to be able to keep that. But at the same time, there is that very real need for engagement. And there is that process of onboarding. And again, we're going to learn new ways of doing it, and we're going to learn new ways of structuring it. But it is an absolutely critical thing. And this is why, I've written some newspaper articles recently about this broad idea of the death of the office. And I think the 20th century was indeed the era of the office. But the office is, it's only a partial death, because people will continue to need that direct kind of onboarding, that direct kind of engagement, and really the sheer joy that actually comes from completing a project together, or the sheer satisfaction that comes from enduring a failure together. And really, that is what builds teams, is that ability to work. And you're not going to be able to, certainly as yet, replicate that through mediums such as that which we're talking through now. And so businesses will need to have that kind of, again, that flexibility and the agility, and they will need to be prepared to experiment. And the art of experiment is to accept that there will be failures en route.
John, if I could
James Manyika, there's
to...
that adage that people... and let me tee you off a bit here. That there's that adage that people join companies but leave managers. So maybe in your response here, can you include a sense of whether we need to change the way management skill, management effectiveness is evaluated when we can't see it as well, perhaps in person?
Well, I think the management skills are going to need to evolve. Let me point to one other example in addition to the issue of joiners, is the issue around coaching and development, which typically managers do. One of the things that's being lost in this kind of remote context that we're all working in is the idea of kind of giving feedback, giving kind of coaching, watching how other people do things. Senior people bumping into junior people and interacting with them and kind of role modeling, all of that becomes much harder in this environment. So even the role that managers have in leading, developing, growing their people becomes a little bit harder in this context. So even when people are being efficient and productive, all that other frictional stuff around coaching development gets lost. Now, we're seeing the emergence of kind of, again, more experimentation about practices that are emerging for doing that. There are people going on virtual walks together. There are people, some managers who are creating office hours, as it were, online as a way to give access to people to be able to pop in and have a brief conversation, trying to recreate or create new rituals, if you like, that are now allow managers to do all the other things that they typically do in person, but also particularly around coaching, development, and growth and progression.
I get that, James Manyika, but I wonder, how does the manager's manager, how does the C-suite evaluate how well the middle managers and even higher level managers in the organization are doing that, when so much of that, soft data of, seeing people in the office, having a sort of experience, watching the cohesion take place before the project gets launched, so much of that might be harder to see, and all you really clearly see is the product itself. What ways might we have to evaluate some of that soft data that we're going to be perhaps missing, at least missing getting in the ways that we traditionally have?
Yeah, no, it's a good push, John. I think one of the things that I've been seeing quite a lot is the growing and expansive use of all kinds of surveys and pulsing that's happening inside corporations, where people are trying to find mechanisms to create that soft data, if you like, about how are you feeling connected, are you connected with your teammates, with your manager? And I think that kind of information could be the basis of at least giving some indication of how managers are creating supportive, kind of conducive team environments for their people. But I think even the C-suite is going to have to think about how do we do that. Just to look on the bright side, though, One of the things that I've certainly heard quite a lot of C-suite executives comment on is how they feel that they, in this moment, contrary to everything else, they feel like they're able to communicate more directly with their people. Because what happens with these online platforms is that you can also invite a whole range of people to participate. So I've actually heard, spoken to CEOs who feel they're able to communicate better and more in this environment, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. James Suzman, briefly, if you can, a quick final thought for us.
My final thought is, I suppose it relates directly to what James is saying. When we talk about, the metrics for assessing workforces, I think we have to accept that when the landscape changes very considerably, the very metrics by which we evaluate the success or the cohesion of a workforce are going to change as well. Those are things we're going to have to tinker with and establish and try and learn to understand. And those are going to be different to what they were before, in the same way that office life was measured in very different terms in the early noughties to the way it was in the late 80s and again in the 50s. And we've got to expect that change is there. And I think the trick is really not to be frightened of it, but to embrace it and to recognize that experimentation is the key. And again, with experimentation, to recognize that when you do experiment, you get things wrong.
All right, James Suzman, James Manyika, thank you so much for those insights.